Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to you all. Welcome to the first of 4 ELCA Churchwide Assembly Bible study sessions on the theme, Embody the Word. Our theme this year is a great one, Embody the Word. We will be exploring the meaning of embodiment found in Luke chapter 24. I'm Denise Rector, and I will be moderating today's session. And we're so fortunate to have Reverend Dr. Javier Alanis with us, who will join us after the video presentation to do a little Q&A and reflection on the Bible study session. So before we get started today, there are a couple of housekeeping notes that I wanted to share with you really quick. So on this Zoom webinar, if you take your mouse and hover near the bottom of the screen, you'll see 4 controls. There is an audio setting control, which will let you pick the speakers for your device. So if you need to switch that, that's where that is. There is a chat control that will let you send a message via Zoom in case you have a technical question about anything happening. There is a raise your hand feature. Because we have so many people on the webinar, we're going to try to not use the raise your hand feature. If you do have a really urgent technical issue though, and you need to get to someone via Zoom, you can also try that along with the chat. So the 4th control, the most important control today, is going to be the Q&A button. The Q&A button is what's going to allow you to ask your questions about the Bible study session to Reverend Dr. Alanis, who's going to join us later, and I will be moderating that Q&A section. So on a Zoom webinar, so not like a Zoom meeting, but more of a webinar we're doing here, I can't see you. So there's no active attendee camera. So if clarification is needed for one of your questions, if it comes through and maybe I have a little bit of trouble understanding it, I might ask you to hop off mute and just speak your question. But we're hoping to get questions pretty clear through the chat so that we can put them into chat and everyone can see them and we can go that route and use our 45 to 50 minutes wisely that way. So now that I've done the housekeeping, I am very pleased to introduce to you the recorded video session of today's Bible study, which is going to start in just a minute. And then after that, I will be back on with Reverend Dr. Alanis for your questions.
Good afternoon, or as we say in Spanish, buenas tardes. Or if you're hearing this in the morning, buenos dias. And if you're hearing this in the evening, it's buenas noches. So take your pick. But it is a joy to be with you today. It's a joy to be with you leading this church-wide devotional on the walk to Emmaus. Or as we say in Spanish, El Camino a Emaús. We are all familiar with this beautiful Easter story of the 2 disciples walking to Emmaus when they encounter Jesus as the stranger or the foreigner. But first, let me say something about myself. I'm a former professor and the former director of the Lutheran Seminary program in the Southwest in Austin. I taught Lutheran, Episcopal, and students from other traditions at the Episcopal Seminary of the Southwest for over 20 years. I'm also a baptized child of God from South Texas, where I now live and serve as the pastor of my home church, St. John Lutheran, in San Juan, Texas, located about 20 miles from the US-Mexico border. So I come from a border church, and I will invite you to see yourselves as border crossers during this devotional. I will clarify what I mean with my devotional questions in the study guide. I have taken seminary students to the Texas-Mexico border for over 20 years. I have walked with them in the border spaces between our two nations, a walk that has been part of my life's journey. I am the son of Mexican immigrants who came to South Texas over 100 years ago during their flight from Mexico's Civil War. I am bilingual and navigate life between two cultures, the US American and the culture of my Mexican or Latinx heritage. I am a hybrid person, if you will, who lives within the spaces of two cultures and two languages at the same time. So when I read and study the scriptures, I read them in two languages to get a richer perspective. I will do that with you during our time together. I address the Easter story of Emmaus from within the context of a bilingual and bicultural border space, where there is a constant movement of peoples and an interchange of ideas. I hear differently at the border than I do in other parts of the country, and that includes how I hear and experience the gospel. As a bilingual and bicultural person, I will address some of the language differences that I notice when I read the gospel in Spanish. I will also use the English and the Spanish interchangeably, because that is how we speak in South Texas. First, biblical scholars have pointed out that one of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus was more than likely a woman, because she is unnamed in the text. Cleopas is named because he is a man. Women were not usually named in the gospel stories unless they figured prominently, such as Mary of Magdala or Jesus' friends, Mary and Martha. The nameless disciple is something I want us to consider in the text, because there are many unnamed women and people who walk their journey of faith to the US-Mexico border from all over the world. So, knowing people by their name is important for those of us who experience invisibility and namelessness. There are many folks like this unnamed disciple at the US-Mexico border as I speak. I have met them. I have heard their stories. I have prayed with them, as I did this past January when I took seminary students to El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Second, these disciples are experiencing grief at the loss of Jesus of Nazareth. As they walk, they are reliving the memory of the crucifixion. They are sad, tristes, or cabizbajos, we say in Spanish, when they meet Jesus as a stranger on the road. We hear him ask what they are talking about, like a pastoral care concern. We see this kind of grief and feelings of loss of hope and sense of being lost with people of faith who have walked hundreds of miles to get to the US-Mexico border. They often show signs of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The two disciples in the gospel were having that kind of experience. Jesus had been crucified and experienced a most violent death. He had embodied their hope for freedom, freedom from the oppressive Roman government. And now their hope was lost. They were grieving the death of the one they had hoped would redeem Israel, or as my Latin American Bible version states, would bring them freedom, or libertad in Spanish. To lose hope when you live under an oppressive government is a profound loss. The word hope in Spanish is translated as esperanza, which comes from the root word esperar, to wait for something. So to lose hope is to stop waiting for a hopeful outcome. In this case, the freedom that they hoped would come from the actions of the liberator, Jesus of Nazareth. They were not expecting a crucifixion, thus their PTSD. This is similar to the hope and pursuit of freedom that many have in my border spaces of ministry. Many seek freedom from oppression, persecution, death squads, and from political and domestic violence and instability in their home countries. So when the two disciples start telling Jesus their mournful story, they tell him, he was the one we had hoped would redeem Israel. Or to quote the New International Bible Version in Spanish, it reads, pero nosotros abrigábamos la esperanza de que era él quien redimiría a Israel. This translates as, we wore our hope like a garment, like a coat that we were wrapped in, believing and waiting for him to redeem Israel, to set us free from oppression. This is the kind of embodied hope that people bring with them to the US-Mexico border. They wrap their often injured and violated bodies in this expectant hope. They walk the journey with the hope of gaining freedom from death, poverty, violence, persecution, and hopelessness, often meeting them tragically again at the US-Mexico border. Third, the two disciples on the Camino a Emmaus are walking with their memory of loss within what I call a third space. This third space is a liminal or in-between space. This is the space between the hope they once knew by following Jesus and the reality of his death, grief, and resultant loss of hope. They are in this liminal space when they meet the stranger or the alien that is mentioned in the Hebrew canon, a word that is often misused and politicized at the US-Mexico border. This third space is a border space. For those of us living along the US-Mexico border, this is the liminal space between two nations and a multiplicity of global peoples. It is a space where one encounters the holy or the sacred other. This is sacred third space. It is a place where epiphanies occur when one engages another human being with a memory of loss. This is the place where we acquire new awareness. The Brazilian educator Paulo Freire calls this acquired awareness conscientización, or consciousness raising. We become conscious of a new reality in this sacred third space. We acquire a new way of understanding ourselves in relationship to another human being in the sacred encounter. This is what happens to the two disciples. They enter a more profound and meaningful third space when they encounter Jesus as the stranger. The resurrected Jesus comes up to them, joins them on the road, hears them as they recall their embodied memory of loss, and begins to teach them the meaning of their sacred memory from the perspective of the resurrection. He meets them where they are at and gives them a new, more informed interpretation of the scriptures that will lead to their renewed hope and renewed self-awareness. This third space is thus a creative space where new events occur, new visions are acquired, new perspectives are gained, and conversions erupt because of a new awareness. By conversion, I mean that we become what the theologian Paul Tillich would call the new being. We become something new to ourselves and to others because we have entered a third space of sacred encounter. So, what might this all mean for us as the church? I believe we are called to enter this third space. On the one hand, we already live there as a kingdom people, a term I learned from a Cuban theologian to express the idea that we are all kin to each other. As a people of faith, we live in the kingdom now, but not yet fully realized. We live in eschatological liminality. We are a kingdom people called to live in hope because we have been given a promise of new life that has already begun in our baptism and will be fully realized at the end of history or her story, the story of the nameless ones. So we live in the tension of liminal space. We are a kingdom people proclaiming new realities and promises while living in a broken world. There is tension here, but it is also a creative space where the sacred encounters and transforms us. How did the two disciples on the walk to Emmaus experience this third space? They encountered it when the stranger approached them and began the conversation. This was a relational moment. It occurs when the sacred comes to us, as it did for the two on the road. The conversation and exchange led to the invitation to stay the night. In Spanish, we would say, quédate con nosotros, stay with us. This is the invitation to hospitality that our cultures are known for. This invitation is relational. There is mutual encounter here in this third space of hospitality exchange. The two recognize Jesus in the blessing and the breaking of the bread. It is in that moment that their eyes are opened and they recognize him. They receive a new vision and their hope is renewed. This is what happens to us during communion, the Eucharist, and in our border third spaces. So to further interpret this story from the context of the US-Mexico border, I will share with you some of my experiences while taking students to the border third spaces for over 20 years. What I have seen and experienced is a church who enters this third space with intentionality and a strong conviction and commitment to express gospel hospitality with global strangers. In caring for them, the church feeds and clothes them. We serve them meals and provide them with a worship experience of renewed hope. We hear their stories of embodied memory, and we pray with them as an expression of our solidarity. In that third space of encounter, the church is transformed and renewed. The sacred encounters us when we meet global strangers who are coming to us looking for a renewed hope and vision of freedom. Like us, they seek hope for a better future. Like my family, fleeing a civil war over 100 years ago, they carry their hope with them like a garment. They come seeking freedom from unrest, persecution, and death squads. When the church enters this third space willingly and intentionally, the sacred encounters us in the nameless strangers who then become Jose, Maria, Jesus, and Cleopas, the people of our faith story, who express their faith as the gift they offer us. Together in the sacramental third space, we are transformed and renewed by the Spirit of Esperanza. What I have learned at the border third space is that our walk of faith is one of accompaniment, something that our global mission unit of the ELCA has taught us. We walk the journey together and learn to carry each other's burdens along the way. Jesus accompanied the two disciples, Cleopas and the unnamed, and in the walk and the sharing of hospitality, in the breaking of the bread, something new happened. The two received renewed sight, a new vision of one who walks with them on their journey to freedom. The good news that he was alive and resurrected is the same good news that we deliver to our neighbors when we meet them at the border and share a meal. They share with us their story of the one who walks with them on the journey north, the same one who walks the journey with us in our border third spaces. In that encuentro, the sacred encounter, we join the rest of the disciples in celebrating the good news. He is risen and walks with us on the road to freedom. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Welcome back, everybody, to the live portion of our Bible study webinar. And I'm so very happy to have the Reverend Dr. Javier Alanis live on screen. Hello, how are you today?
Hola, Denise. Qué gusto verte. Always a pleasure to see you. Gracias.
A pleasure to see you as well. Where are you joining us from today?
Today, I am joining you from my casita, my home here in San Juan, Texas, of the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, near McAllen and near Mexico.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. And I am waving to you from Columbus, Ohio. So we're in different parts of the country, but the Spirit has allowed us to spend some time together, for which I am grateful. Thank you so much for your words, for your reflection on the road to Emmaus. I am so looking forward to hearing some more of your thoughts and some of the questions that we have here. We've had a couple of questions come through in Q&A that you were able to thank people for their reflections while you were sitting there live, while we were watching you pre-recorded. There are a couple of other questions in Q&A, and I am going to jump right in because we have just about 15 minutes before we need to wrap up and let folks return to their other Sunday duties. So the first question that I see in my Q&A is coming from Jody Slattery, and I'm going to read that question. Oh, thank you. I'm sort of reading down the Q&As. And if we could get a link to the study guide dropped into the chat, that way folks can kind of pull it up and be looking at it as we're chatting. And while that's happening, I'll read the first question from Jody. Verse 31 talks about the disciples' eyes being opened. So how might we open our eyes and discover ways to embody hope while there's so much violence in our society and not enough systemic change? I can imagine a lot of people might have that question. I certainly am living this question right now. So I know Pastor Jay is Pastor Jay, so I may be going back and forth between Reverend Dr. Alanis and Pastor Jay. But let me give you a moment to speak to this question for us, please.
Sure. Well, thank you for an excellent question, a profound one, I might add. And you're right, it's not easy to see and to hear in a violent age, if you will, because we are indeed living in violent times. And I think the gift of Pentecost that we were able to see and hear differently, and to see and hear diversity and the gift of inclusion. But as far as the violence that we are living in and being exposed to, I think probably a natural self-defense mechanism of the body, if you will, is to shut some of that out, and for the sake of self-protection. But I think that when, as people of faith, we also have a duty and a responsibility to actually see with the eyes of Christ, if you will. And I think that's the gift of our faith, and the gift of our baptism is that we have been given a lens by which to see the world in which we live, through a different way of seeing, with love, seeing with compassion, seeing with empathy, and seeing and hearing with intentionality. And I think I underscored a bit in my talk about the church entering the third spaces. We have to do that with intentionality. And that's why I am so proud of so many of our seminarians who choose to go to the border. Among all of their options of January terms, they choose to come to the border, which is a difficult space, in order to see the effects of violence firsthand and to hear it with gospel ears, see it with gospel eyes, and allow the Holy Spirit then to do something in us and to move us toward a proactive gospel stance, if you will. Solidarity, for example, being a major one that we try to live in every day of our lives here at the border.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer, and also for talking some more about the wonderful January term course that you offer to seminary students that attend ELCA seminaries. It's really, really very important and very special. So I have two questions here about the idea of third space. So one question is sort of about the history background of third space, and also when is it appropriate to talk about third space? Sort of what stage of faith development? Like, is it something confirmation kids can grasp? Is it an adult education topic? How and when is it beneficial to begin to talk about that third space?
Sure. Again, thank you for the questions. It took me a lifetime to come up with this concept, because I wrestled with my own identity as a bilingual and bicultural hybrid person. And I think there's many types of hybridity in the human experience. So it's not just cultural, it's also a gender, for example, the non-binary a spectrum experience. So it was through my PhD work that I developed this whole concept of living in third space, because it was a personal experience that I didn't have words for, and that even in seminary, when I was in seminary 30 years ago, I couldn't find the words and the scholarship to explain this reality that I was living in, and I was not the only one living in that space. I knew there had to be many others. So So I don't think there's a specific time to begin speaking. I think many of our teenagers have a lot to teach us, just based on their own experience, for example, in schools and in being different. But I think that to explain, or two words that might, or three words perhaps, that might capture the essence of a third space is dissonance. You know, when you experience dissonance, that's an indication that of another kind of experience that you're living in. Disorientation is another word, and creative tension is another third expression, I think, for that experience. And I think these are things that are ageless. I mean, I think you can be as young as a third grader, an 8-year-old, to experience dissonance, disorientation, creative tension in the way you're discovering yourself vis-a-vis your environment. And so I think as far as when to begin that conversation, I would say as early as you can, really, because anytime you experience difference, there is a creative tension taking place there. And I think that giving words, articulating that experience is what we need to hear, you know, because I wasn't hearing that in my formation experience. I didn't hear that language that I've been able to develop over time that kind of, I hope, captures my personal experience at the border, which I know is the experience of many people throughout our country. And it's not specific to culture. I think it's beyond culture. I hope that can kind of shed some light.
Yeah, Pastor Jay, it does. And I'm so intrigued by your answers. I'd like to just continue this line of discussion just a little bit before I go to the next question. Some of what I've heard you say is that this third space hybridity is deeply experiential.
Yes.
And that it is maybe not the most comfortable thing in the world, right?
Correct.
So thinking about how we as humans tend to run from our discomfort,
Yes.
as how thinking about ideas about fitting in and assimilation, so this line of discussion that we're having is really counter to that. And I just think it bears repeating that, yes, there is maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling. And maybe when you frame that as creative tension, so you use dissonance and disorientation and then creative tension. In my mind, that helps me to kind of reframe some of the uncomfortable feelings that come around this third space idea and this idea of difference, whether it is something that we have identified as difference in gender or difference in denomination or difference in culture, race, language. I just really appreciate that. And I don't know if you have any other words to add, anything else to come back with.
Yes,
let me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that welcome feedback, Denise. When I speak of creative tension, what I'm really referring to is the fact that the sacred walks with us. The Holy Spirit is with us, and the Spirit is a very, very creative spirit, and we are very creative beings. So in what I have found over time is that in that third space, even though there is that dissonance, disorientation, uncomfortableness, the Spirit at the same time is involved in creating something new. And that new person is the new being that Paul Tillich would talk about, the theologian Paul Tillich, that in creative tension, something new is being birthed. And in that birthing process, there's going to be discomfort because something new is emerging. And that's why we feel the dissonance. That's why we feel the disorientation. But at the same time, the Spirit is at work in us, creating something new. And sometimes we don't know what that newness is or will look like, but we're smack in the middle of the faith journey when it's happening to us. And at the same time, as disorienting as it is a hopeful moment, because we realize with some conscientización, with some consciousness raising, that God is about doing a new thing, and we're involved in that creative process.
I'm just so energized by that second response that you were able to give. Thank you so much. I tried to catch some of the wonderful things you were saying about the Spirit creating something new. And just to bring us back to this focus on embodiment, there were so many rich images of birth and creation that you were giving in that explanation, and also adding the Spirit walking with us, just like we are seeing in our foundational text, in our Luke text. So we have just about 5 or 6 minutes left. I see one question and a couple of observations. I'm going to jump to the next question to get some time for that, and then we'll see how much time we have for the other observations. Let's see, another third space question. In the third spaces, how can we best absorb that transformational encounter in order to share it in those other spaces we inhabit? So how do we take that transformation out of third space living into the rest of our living, or expand our living so that it all becomes third space living? We could go either way.
Sure, great question again. I think that conversion has, and I call it a conversion because anytime you have a third space encounter, there are epiphanies that occur. We become more aware of the realities around us, and of the hard truths around us, the hard truths of the communities we're living in, the challenges of our communities. And so number one, we're transformed by this third space encounter that I call in my text. We're transformed, but we take that transformation outward into the world in which we live. And one of the ways that I recommend that, especially to congregations, is to explore the boundaries of difference in your community. Because wherever there's a boundary of difference, and they're all around us, they're all in every community, if there are different people groups, different immigrants coming into the community, different faith traditions in our community, as you explore and move relationally into these boundaries of difference, you're going to experience and discover that other people are having those same experiences that you may have been unaware of. And in relating to those folks, in forming friendships with these folks in your own community, you're going to form a new awareness of a new community that has a similar life experience. The best way I can describe it in brief is this wonderful sermon that I heard this morning from a parishioner that I invited to deliver a homily on the Good Samaritan. And she spoke about, here in the Rio Grande Valley, an organization called All Faiths United. And she shared with us all of the friendships that she has formed among all the faith traditions of South Texas, and the wonderful, the awareness that we all share common sacred texts, and that has kind of elevated her consciousness to the point that she has formed bonds with people that normally we wouldn't consider friends or people that we would associate with. But it was an intentional movement by her, because her consciousness was raised as she was converted by her life experience here at the border. And she's a person from the upper Midwest who moved to the border and has been transformed by the third space that she has been living in for several years. So there's intentional movement that occurs when you have that transformation. It compels you and impels you outward rather than inward.
Outward rather than inward. That is such a huge point that I'm a note taker. I'm still a student. So I've been dropping a few things that you said in the chat. And that is one of those one of those huge ones about turning outward rather than inward. So you all can hear me typing right now, I know. And we are coming up on our 45 minutes. And I was trying to prepare for this moment because I knew that we were going to get more Q&A, more responses, more reflections than we're going to have time for. I'm very thankful that you all can see the Q&A. We've had people post 1 or 2 times. I see a Mr. Ryder or Mr. Brickley, Ms. Keel, Berglund. I'm hoping that you all have a moment or two to jot down the things that ring out to you via this Bible study discussion that the 219 of us are having all at the same time. But as we are coming up close on our time, I am going to begin to wrap us up. And the first thing that I want to do is thank Reverend Dr. Javier Alanis, Pastor Jay, for being our first Bible study session panelist and for setting such a wonderful frame for us for the upcoming weeks as we prepare our hearts and our minds for Churchwide Assembly. Thank you so much, Pastor Jay.
You're quite welcome. Ha sido un placer, a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As we wrap up today, again, I invite you to take a look at the Q&A and at what is in the chat. Please know that this will be posted on the ELCA's Facebook page. And when YouTube webinars are recorded, the chat is also recorded. If there are notes in there that you didn't get, you might be able to access those on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for your time during the question and answer portion of the video. Consider Pastor Jay's other questions on the Bible study guide. And for now, we will call our Bible study complete. We will wrap up here. And please join us again next week at the same time for our next wonderful Bible study. Goodbye for now and peace.
Hasta luego.